Oh, hello. You might be wondering what wood chips and alcohol have to do with each other. But for this presentation, we will be explaining how we can turn something quite useless, cellulose chips, into something quite useful, alcohol.
Even if you don't drink, everyone in Canada consumes ethanol. Look at your gas pumps. When you go fuel up, you will see the percentage of ethanol used in fuel. The vast majority of our ethanol in Canada comes from corn. In South America and other parts of the world, it might come from leftover rice. It could come from sugarcane. That is a big one. Some comes from sugar beets, but in North America, our predominant crop is corn, which we also use as food. As a fuel additive, it can be traded quite cheaply. It's $1.25 a liter, and that's fuel used for automobiles, not for drinking. It'd probably be quite unpalatable for at that price. And the one reason why we don't have a higher ethanol blend in Canada compared to Brazil is that ethanol does not burn well at cold temperatures. So while Brazil can have a 50% ethanol content, us in Canada, it is much lower. It runs between about 10 to 30%. There are ethical problems using food as fuel. A lot of resources that would be dedicated towards growing food are now going towards creating gasoline additives. And this creates a problem because there's a competition for those resources. And resources diverted towards biofuel productions always drive up food prices as a result. This happened before in 2008. If you see the spike to the left side of the graph, that's wheat per bushel. There was a huge spike in food increases back then because there was a push for biodiesel at the time. And we are experiencing a similar spike right now. Maybe not for similar reasons, but it's of special note because whenever there is food insecurity, there's social instability, and we want to avoid that. So food for fuel isn't a very great idea. Now that we've established that food for fuel is a very, very bad idea, we need to look for another source of energy. And one thing that we have an energy source in plenty in Canada is cellulose. It is everywhere in straw, old paper, lawn clippings. We have so much of it that when it burns, it blocks out the sun in the interior during forest fire season. And we have just this vast amount of biomass that is going to waste. Corn cobs are another source. Rice straw, you don't need to be able to use trees. And the process is called cellulosic ethanol. And cellulosic ethanol is a very old process. It was known 100 years ago in Germany. And right now there are two main methods for creating cellulosic ethanol. There's the acid method or an enzyme method. And what happens is we break down our buddy, the wood fiber here, composed of lignin, cellulose, and hemicellulose in a pre-treatment step, and that allows us to treat it just as we would a fruit or a grain or a corn, and add yeast and make alcohol.
Now that we have done an overview of what cellulosic ethanol is, we can now go a bit more into depth of the science and what occurs behind the scenes to create this product. This graphic shows a good depiction of the two main processes involved in creating cellulose ethanol. The first major step in this process is hydrolysis, which is defined as the chemical breakdown of a compound due to its reaction with water. In our case, this occurs when water and sulfuric acid is mixed with enzymes to produce heat, xylose, and glucose. An image of this chemical reaction, as well as a graphic for the process, can be seen on this slide. It is important to note that the heat produced as a byproduct of this reaction is technically recoverable heat, so it can be harnessed and used in other processes to reduce the energy consumption. The next step in this process is fermentation, where this describes the process where sugars produced in the previous step of hydrolysis are metabolized using microbial fermentation. In our case, the microbes used are most commonly yeast. An image of this chemical reaction can be seen on this slide, where it shows glucose being chemically broken down by microorganisms to produce ethanol and a small amount of carbon dioxide as well.
An economic review is now required to allow us to evaluate the feasibility of creating cellulosic ethanol from wood waste in comparison to other already present methods. Most of the research of the feasibility behind this method has been done in countries such as Brazil, which is one of the largest producers of cellulosic ethanol from wood waste. Inputs that make up ethanol fermentation. Sawmill chips or wood waste such as burned slashes and trees affected by pine beetles, pretreatment agents, enzymes, yeast, water, heat which can be recovered from within different components in the pulp mill, and electricity. Each of the inputs to create cellulosic ethanol have their own associated costs. Considering the majority of the research is done in units of USD dollars per gallon yield, the associated values will be given as such. The biomass, which is sawdust and wood waste, is considered to cost nothing as this was already considered as a throwaway. The pretreatment agents yield one of the largest costs of 42 cents per gallon yield. The enzymes used are 30 cents per gallon yield, and the yeast has a relatively low cost of 9 cents per gallon yield. The water cost was approximated from the cost of dollars per gallon in Victoria, which came out to be around 28 cents per gallon yield. The heat was considered to be zero, as it is being recovered from various components throughout the pulp mills, such as the smokestacks. And the highest cost is the electricity to run all of the components to create the ethanol through fermentation. This associated cost was 88 cents per gallon yield. This totals out to approximately $2.29 per gallon yield. When comparing this to the current selling price of ethanol in the US, creating cellulosic ethanol through fermentation, you are essentially losing 9 cents per gallon yield at the moment. Corn is currently one of the largest producers of ethanol in the current market. A comparison between the selling prices of it and wood waste cellulosic ethanol will provide a benchmark of how feasible wood waste ethanol currently is. The current selling price of corn ethanol is around $2.11 per gallon, and as seen in the last slide, the current selling price of ethanol is around $2.20 per gallon. That means that corn ethanol will yield around 9 cents per gallon in comparison to wood waste, which will actually lose around 9 cents per gallon. Although wood waste ethanol isn't feasible at the moment, this may change in the future due to the linear increase in carbon tax costs in North America, which will have a big effect on the price of corn ethanol far more than wood waste ethanol, as well as the increase of land costs, which will increase the cost of corn ethanol as it takes vast amounts of land for corn crops. With countries looking for more environmentally friendly and sustainable solutions, wood waste ethanol may be a promising economic endeavor in the future.
Currently, ethanol is primarily produced using corn. By converting to cellulosic ethanol, the need for 1/3 of corn produced in the United States and 110,000 square kilometers of farmland would be eliminated. This would also reduce emissions associated with harvesting corn by 1/3 and result in more resources available for other agricultural products, indirectly reducing deforestation for farmland. Because waste wood is a byproduct of sawmills, the impact of using it as the source of cellulose for ethanol production is almost zero. Corn production, on the other hand, is highly carbon intensive from start to finish. Unlike for cellulosic ethanol, the distillation process for corn-based ethanol is fuel-powered, as is the farm equipment used to harvest corn. While this is true for the harvesting process of wood as well, it should not be factored into the impact of cellulosic ethanol, because wood is not harvested for this purpose. Unlike forests, corn crops need to be refertilized periodically, and fertilizers are derived from natural gas, which is another carbon-intensive process. A carbon cost of 4 grams per kilogram of corn produced is seen on average. Meanwhile, the average carbon cost of wood waste from sawmills is effectively zero. Cellulosic ethanol repurposes existing waste wood and low-grade waste heat produced by sawmills to break down wood fibers through acid treatment and enzymatic action, which then produces sought-after simple sugars for ethanol production. This is a different process than that used for corn-based ethanol, and is able to be completed without dedicated carbon input thanks to the use of waste heat. Waste wood from sawmills is plentiful enough to meet the current demand to produce cellulosic ethanol. In the event that this method of ethanol production is widely adopted and waste wood is no longer providing enough material, there still would not be a need for dedicated deforestation. Instead, other sources of cellulose such as switchgrass, corn stover, and rice straw could be used to make up this deficit. In addition to being plentiful, all these alternatives are agricultural byproducts that would result in very low carbon intensity. As a result of all of these factors, cellulosic ethanol is vastly environmentally superior to corn-based ethanol and should be pursued as a more common means of ethanol production in the future.